If you like poetry, do you find that you're drawn more to the classics, or do you prefer a more modern day approach to poetry, or even ultra modern? Right now, there's something out there, a big trend called Insta poetry, and that's just a couple little lines of poetry. Um, something that you might see on Instagram or something that could be read quickly in a Reels video. And typically, those are, just a couple lines. They don't typically rhyme, and a lot of times they are accompanied by a pencil sketch to illustrate the poem. And so that's a new trend that's happening in poetry right now as well. So I am more of a modern day or contemporary poet. My channel is called The Practical Poet, and I have a blog of the same name at thepracticalpoet.com. So I tend to stick to more writing, the storytelling type of poetry. My poetry does rhyme, and typically ends up telling a story. And that's just my personal style. Not all poetry is like that. It doesn't have to be. I'm not saying that one style is better than the other. That's just kind of how I write. But recently I've been delving a little bit more into the classics. I really haven't gone in that route since like high school or college when we had to dissect a poem. A lot of times I wasn't sure if I was interpreting the poem correctly. And a lot of times it's written in Old English, and just big words that I didn't really understand. And so I kind of shied away from it. But I've been taking a trip a little bit down into the classics lately. And a few weeks ago I did one by Emily Dickinson called Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And I'm not getting into like a big analyzing of the poem. There are channels out there that do that and that are going to dissect every single word and every single line of the poem. I'm not really doing that. I'm just reading the poem, a couple verses if it's longer, and telling a little bit about when it was published, when maybe what the intent behind it was, if I can find that. And then I have been trying to find a more modern day poem and kind of make a comparison and bounce the two up and be like, hey, these are both on the same subject. So when I did the Emily Dickinson one, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, I bounced that up against a poem with somebody who had also died and was in the afterlife. And so there was that common theme there. And so I've been trying to find those parallels between the classical and the modern on the same subject. What I have found out through this process is it's not so much when the poem was written, but how it was written. And for me personally, I have rediscovered, I mean, I've kind of always known this about myself, but I do rather enjoy a poem that tells a story, whether or not it rhymes, but I do really enjoy the rhyming poetry. So think about like "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," or even, Dr. Seuss with How the Grinch Stole Christmas. So I must be in like a Christmas theme right now, probably because it's snowing outside right now. So, but those, kind of tell a nice story. And I like when a poem tells a story and kind of wraps it up with a nice bow at the end, and you walk away like when you read a good book and you close that book and you're like, wow, that was really nice. I enjoyed that story. So I'm finding it doesn't really matter if it's a classical or a modern, but I do enjoy the storytelling aspect of poetry. And there are some classics out there that do that as well. So think about like Edgar Allan Poe with The Raven, or like I just mentioned, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," which was published, I believe, in 1823 or 1893. That sounds more like it, but a long time ago, and still a classic to this day, right? We all know that story, and we probably all read it or can recite it every Christmas. So that's just what I enjoy. How about you? What do you like? Are you drawn to the classics? Do you like them, or do you enjoy a more modern day? If you enjoy a more modern day approach, I hope that you will come over and check out my channel, The Practical Poet. And each week I do a video poetry reading from one of my 4 books, or maybe even some new material. And I also tell a little bit of the backstory. How did the poem come to be? What was my motivation behind it? What was I thinking when I wrote it? What was my inspiration? And sometimes just my rambling thoughts, sometimes just no inspiration at all. I'm just like, hey, this came to me and I wrote it, and I don't really have much to say about that. So, but typically I'm pretty wordy, and my poems tend to be a little bit longer. They do tell a bit of a story, and tend to be that rhyming cadence. So I hope that you will check it out. This week I am focusing on a classical poem by Robert Frost. And I enjoy this poem. The last 2 lines of this poem are words that I say to myself a lot. And I knew that they were from a Robert Frost poem, but I couldn't remember which one. So I'm happy to discover this. And I'll tell you when I read the poem about those last 2 lines. So this is a poem called Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. You may be familiar with it. Now, normally when I do the reading, I only read a couple of verses if it's a little bit longer poem, but this is a short poem. It's only 4 verses. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the whole thing. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the poem. And then I will read a similar in subject matter poem from the modern day era. And that one is a little bit longer. So I'm only going to read a couple of verses on that one. But for this one, I am going to go ahead and read the whole poem. Again, this is by Robert Frost. This is a poem called Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So notice he repeated those last 2 lines twice to add emphasis to the miles that he has to go before he sleeps. And those are words that I say a lot. Like, when you're trying to get ready for bed and suddenly you're like, oh, I remember I have to pack my bag for tomorrow, or I have to make lunch, or I have to pay a bill that I have to get in the mail tomorrow. And suddenly you're just trying to get to bed and things are stacking up on you. And I'll say to myself, and miles to go before I sleep. And not really remembering the origin. I knew, like I said, it was a Robert Frost poem, but I didn't really remember what exact poem it was. So I'm happy to have discovered the origin of those lines. So now when I quote those lines, I know I can credit Mr. Frost's poem Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. This was a poem that was written in 1922. It was published in 1923 in Frost's New Hampshire volume. So he wrote the poem, it states on here, this is Wikipedia is my source here, states that he wrote the poem in June of 1922 at his house in Shaftesbury, can't say that, Shaftesbury, Vermont. I apologize if you're from that area and I just butchered the name of your town. I apologize for that. It states on here that he had been up the entire night writing the long poem New Hampshire from the poetry collection of the same name. He finally finished when he realized that it was morning, and he went out to view the sunrise, and he suddenly got the idea for stopping by woods on a snowy evening. He wrote the poem, and he states on here that he wrote it as if he had a hallucination, and he wrote it in just a few minutes without strain. Now that's incredible to me, that this man had been up all night long writing this longer poem, The New Hampshire, which I have yet to delve into. I'm going to have to check that one out. But you would think that he would just be so fatigued and just want to go to bed. But he steps outside and he realized that it was morning and that it had snowed over the evening. And he got this inspiration and he just wrote it that quickly. And I have had those flashes of inspiration. Sometimes it takes a while for an idea for a poem to make its way onto the page. And other times it's just the words just spill out and you can't stop them. And I get the impression that that's maybe what happened with this one for Mr. Frost. He just was probably tired, but maybe had that second wind. You know how that feeling, tired but wired, and your brain just won't shut down. And maybe he was in that state, and he just wrote this poem very quickly, according to him. So I'm glad that he did. I really enjoy this poem, and like I stated, and miles to go before I sleep. Some of the things that I read on this talk about, what does this poem really mean? And it has to do with the obligations that we have in life. And, we want to stop and we want to enjoy the beauty that's around us when we see it. But we all have those obligations, and that's what this poem is about. As he is going through the woods, he's trying to take in the beauty of the scenery around him, and he wants to just kind of stop and watch the woods fill up with snow, as it states on here. But he also realizes that he's not only got miles to go before he sleeps, but he states that twice. So he must have a long way to go. And so he pauses for a moment, takes in the beauty around him, but then he knows that he must trudge on. So it's kind of that appreciation of the beauty around you and appreciation of nature, but also realizing that, you can only enjoy it for a moment and then you have to keep moving on. So have you ever been in a situation where you have to get somewhere, maybe you deliver something for work, or you have to be somewhere at a certain time, and you're driving by and maybe you see a beautiful lake and maybe the sun is rising or setting, and you stop for a moment and you just take in that beauty. But then you're like, it's short-lived because you have to keep moving on. You have that obligation to fulfill. And that is what this poem is about, that he was enjoying the beauty for just a short time, but he had to keep moving on. And unfortunately, he couldn't stop for the evening, but he did stop for a moment. He took in the beauty and then kept moving on. So again, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening from 1920, written in 22, published in 1923, featured in Robert Frost's book, New Hampshire. So I hope that you enjoyed that. So a more modern day poem has to do with that same kind of taking in nature and appreciating nature, but also kind of getting caught up in the fray of everyday life and feeling like things are a little bit out of control. So I'll go ahead and read that poem now. I'm not going to read this whole thing. It is a little bit longer, so I'm just going to read a few verses of this. This is a poem called Equilibrium, and I'm starting in the middle of the poem here. And again, equilibrium. Just like the sun and moon, each have their time to shine. Just like the rain and rainbow, await their turn in line. Just like the pending snow that waits patiently to fall, our lives keep on revolving and we adapt through it all. We seek balance in our own lives so that sanity will prevail. We use it to move us forward like the wind beneath the sail. We ride the waves as they crash in and bring chaos to our world. We seek the calm and peaceful seas when life becomes unfurled. We grasp the stillness when we can, for we know it will not last, and soon upheaval will arrive like a spell that has been cast. So that is a small excerpt, a couple verses from the poem Equilibrium. This is actually one of my poems. This comes from my latest book called So Seeds of Wisdom. This came out in April or May of last year, 2024. And this is a poem about kind of finding balance and how the world will always try to seek balance. And the poem makes a lot of nature references, the sun and moon rising, the ocean, the waves crashing, the stillness that we try to find. And so a lot of nature references similar to Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, taking in that nature, but realizing that it's not going to last. The calmness that we may feel for a moment is probably not going to last very long. Something else is going to come along and shake our worlds up. But that, we still have to try to seek and find that balance in our lives. And so that was the main point of this theme. Talks a little bit about the butterfly effect. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but that's based on the concept that if a butterfly halfway across the world flaps its wings, it has that effect on the rest of the world. And so how the universe is going to try to seek that balance and kind of find that equilibrium. And that's something that's prevalent in all of our lives every day, right? We're always trying to find that balance between work and home life, and time spent with kids and time spent with friends, and always trying to seek balance. And we stop and we enjoy those moments of nature when we can, and we enjoy those moments of stillness because we know that they're not going to last. And most of us, like Robert Frost in his poem, have miles to go before we sleep, right? So on that, I'm going to go ahead and end this. I hope that you enjoyed hearing about those two poems, one from very classical 1922, 1923, and then one from more recent times, 2024, from my book, So Seeds of Wisdom, and that one was called Equilibrium. So if you have a preference, I hope that you post in the comments. Let me know your thoughts. I'd love for you to check out my channel at thepracticalpoet.com. I have a blog of the same name with thepracticalpoet.com/blog, where you can find the whole printed copy of Equilibrium along with the backstory. I have not yet done a video poetry reading of Equilibrium, but when I do, I will link it below. And with that, I thank you for sticking with me for this little comparison of classic to modern poetry. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Thanks so much for joining me. Bye-bye.